Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another very interesting session of the Delphi Economic Forum. As we are close to a wrap-up, we discuss the 75-year trajectory of what, of course, it has been of NATO. And the panel it has an interesting title, From Vilnius to Washington, the last to the next summit. A lot has happened within the past year and is still going on. If you catch the news this weekend, I mean, it's full of thrill. And I have three very interesting guests here with great credentials and a lot of expertise to discuss what is happening around the world. Mr. Brzezinski, Mr. Daalder, and Ms. Paula Dobriansky. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here. Welcome to Greece. I don't know if it's your first time here. No.
First time in Delphi.
First time in Delphi, great. Let me start with a war in Ukraine, which was a wake-up call for NATO. What do you think of the alliance response up to this point? And my actual question is, has it been enough? Is it more that NATO and the members of the alliance can do? Let me start with Mr. Daalder.
So let's start off with that NATO has done very little. The NATO countries have done a lot. But NATO as an alliance has done a little bit on planning and a little bit of non-lethal aid, but hasn't actually been fundamentally involved in helping Ukraine. What it has focused on is to defend NATO. And it's made it very clear from the very beginning that NATO exists to defend, quote, every inch of NATO territory, and it has focused and refocused its mission centrally on that very strong and very important element. And they've done a series of modernizations. The way I would call it is it relearned its muscle memory from the Cold War. It started to rethink how a military alliance needs to prepare, needs to think about its force structure and force capabilities in a fundamentally different way than it had over the last 30 years. And it's well along the way of doing that. It used a variety of summits, Madrid, Vilnius, will use Washington as means towards that end. But in terms of what it has done for Ukraine, it is very little because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And so the responsibility fell to the individual countries of NATO. And there, I think the response has been surprisingly robust. And with one notable exception, surprisingly sustained. And the notable exception is the one that no one thought was going to be the problem, and usually isn't, but is today, and that's the United States of America, which has, for reasons that are really unrelated to Ukraine, found itself in a political pickle when it comes to the question of supplemental assistance. We can debate whether certain.
We'll come back to it in a
you can debate the extent, but I think in the large point I would make is that there's been a surprising degree of support for Ukraine. Whether it is sufficient for what Ukraine needed and needs, I think, is something we can have a debate about.
Mr. Dobriansky, do you agree?
I see it a little bit differently than Ivo. I think Ivo, described it in very, should I say, precise terms. But let me say why I have a difference from him. First, I do think that NATO has been galvanized by the war in Ukraine. I think actually before there was some complacency. We know that the U.S. perspective during the Trump administration was that there was a need to have a stronger investment, and why not? We should be prepared collectively within NATO. So to me, I'll start with that. I think it's very striking, the fact that the war, yes, individual countries call their own shots in terms of what they're going to put forward for the defense spending. But I also think it's part of that unity of purpose, the mission of NATO, and it being challenged here as a whole, and the concern about what the future holds beyond Ukraine. So in that sense, I'll start with, I think, some of the kinds of developments we've seen, certainly in terms of the defense budget. I mean, I look at the country of Poland. Poland could be commended individually for declaring it's going to go up 4% in terms of its defense budget. But also, I think that does have ramifications for NATO as a whole. I don't see this as individual countries. So in this sense, one, I will mention that I think is significant. I think now Stoltenberg also touted that 18 of the 32 countries have really come up to the declared defense spending level, and that shouldn't be a cap at all in this case. Secondly, I do want to pick out Stoltenberg himself, his leadership role. I think that it is one that has played a key role in terms of NATO as an alliance itself. Yes, individual countries matter in this, but I think his leadership, the clarity of purpose, the intent of trying to bring in everyone, in this sense, I think our administration has also worked very hard diplomatically on all fronts, in capital, but also in NATO.
So you don't see an institutional failure here as you describe it? You see, as far as I can understand, you are saying that Ukraine gave, again, NATO a reason to exist and come together?
Yes, absolutely, because there was complacency, but interestingly enough, in this case, no, it was stepping up to the plate and looking at all the ramifications, including with the putting out of the strategic concept. Let me mention just the last in this, and then I will stop at this point. The other is also the fact that we had NATO enlargement. I don't know if you asked me, quite honestly, in my lifetime, would I have ever expected the enlargement? I mean that seriously. I know that Sweden in an earlier period had debated internally, but you know, it was the fact that, yes, Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine, but in this case, I would commend, I think that NATO has definitely moved forward in the right direction. And I'm going to quote Ian Brzezinski and then turn it to Ian. Ian, we were on another panel, and I think he put it right, especially since this discussion is about Vilnius to Washington, D.C. He put it that for NATO to really maintain its raison d'etre and deterrence and its credibility, what happens in Washington will matter greatly. And in this sense, this is my own opinion, I would like to see us really take concrete steps with bringing Ukraine in. And there are various ways to do that. The Atlantic Council lined up behind the concept of an accession letter, and it was nonpartisan, and saying that we should state very clearly that Ukraine should be brought in and that accession process should begin. Okay. So if it doesn't change in DC, if it's the same as in Vilnius, that's going to lose, as he pointed out, and I'll let Ian expand on it, NATO's credibility. And that goes to your question.
I agree. I share this view, to be perfectly honest, but you passed the ball to Ian Brzezinski. So we heard two different approaches, let's say. Where do you stand?
You know, first, you can't separate NATO, an institution, from its members, because NATO as an organization is an expression, it's the operationalization of the political will of member states. You asked, is the NATO community doing enough to support Ukraine? The answer is unambiguously no. Here we are in the third year of this war. We have 200,000 killed or wounded in Ukraine. We have its economy being devastated daily, just last night and the night before, by missile strikes, not just against military Ukrainian targets, but its civilian infrastructure. We have Ukraine actually slipping. You know, when you look at this, you know, NATO has been history's most successful alliance. And it's been so because it's effectively deployed forces, unmatched interoperable military forces to defend its interests. But it's not only the deployment of those forces, it's the political will, the political grit, the political resolve that the alliance has had in the past that made it such a credible deterrent to aggression. We're not seeing that today in Ukraine. And think about it, the alliance, NATO allies have been deterred from supporting Ukraine the way it should be. And this is really underscored by just the huge gap in capability between the alliance and Russia. NATO constitutes $52 trillion in GDP, according to NATO metrics. Russia's somewhere around 1.8. That's 25. NATO is 25 times the economic weight of Russia. Its defense spending is 10 times. It's $1.2 trillion to roughly $100 billion. And then, of course, NATO forces, in terms of their equipment, their training, and their morale, far surpass exponentially Russian forces. So how is it that the alliance in this conflict, which it describes as existential to its interests, Macron said that, Joe Biden warned us that if Putin wins in this war, we're going to have war in Europe. How is it that the alliance isn't crushing Russia in this conflict? It is a matter of political will. And I'm really worried at this Washington summit, if NATO doesn't put Ukraine onto a clear path to victory, it's going to be a very disillusioning summit when it comes down to the credibility of the alliance in the future.
This brings me to my next question, Mr. Daalder, right away, but I would like a response from you, Mr. Brzezinski. Do you actually think that Putin is going to directly assault a NATO member? Is it a possibility? Is it on the table?
It is a high possibility.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin himself has expressed the desire to reconstitute the former Soviet Union. We know that when you reward revanchists with victory, it only increases their appetite. So it is a real danger. NATO's future, European security, lies on the battlefields of Ukraine, and NATO has to ensure Ukraine prevails if we're going to bring Europe back to a stable peace.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to Europe in a bit, Mr. Daalder.
So let me make 3 points, just to square the circle, because I agree with both of my partners on the stage here. Number one, the question you asked is, what is Ukraine doing? What is NATO doing for Ukraine? And my answer is, NATO as an organization is not doing a lot for Ukraine. NATO's members are. That happens to be a fact. Number two, did Ukraine strengthen and change NATO? Absolutely. In a very fundamental way, in all the ways that Paula laid out, and I could go a lot further. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, NATO has real defense plans. We used to have contingency plans. In fact, when I became ambassador to NATO in 2009, 3 countries had no contingency plans for defending them, the 3 Baltic states, because nobody thought it was necessary to think about those kinds of things. I think what NATO has done in terms of spending, in terms of thinking through, in terms of enlarging, has all strengthened NATO as an institution. Third, I think we need to re-examine the assumption whether what is happening in Ukraine shouldn't actually require NATO, the organization, to think about acting.
To think what?
About acting.
Acting. Okay.
And I think the Washington summit, just like Ian said, is going to be a summit that will have much more in common with the last Washington summit in 1999, when NATO came together to celebrate the 50th anniversary of NATO, when the entire celebration of NATO was supposed to be about the enlargement of the alliance, because it was the first summit, in fact, it was the first major meeting where Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic had members. And that entire summit was spent talking about how we were not going to lose the war in Kosovo.
Yeah.
And indeed, it was that summit that created the unity, including the unsaid but well understood commitment that if necessary, NATO would go into Kosovo on the ground, which it hadn't done. That came out of that summit and actually precipitated an end to the war in a way that NATO cared about. This summit is going to be about that issue. It's not going to be about, I hate to tell you, an invitation to Ukraine about joining, because the question is going to be what is going to happen to Ukraine inside Ukraine, and whether there will still be a Ukraine that could even join NATO. Yes. And that will lead to the question, is it time for NATO actually to take military action in order to support the Ukrainians? That is the debate we're going to be having.
Yes.
If I may I, because
yes,
this
sure,
is an important point. I know you want to go to the next question. Thank you. If we have a little fluidity here, because this is an important point. And because of the title of this, I think that, because you asked the question about what's our assessment of NATO because of the war in Ukraine where it is. And I actually think I hear that all of us in different pieces have the same perspective. We're just maybe wording it a little bit differently. At least that's my takeaway. But what happens in Washington, I think, is really going to be a very clear assessment of whether or not NATO has teeth and whether it is a deterrent. That is, if it's a prick, just a slight movement, it is going to unfortunately be discredited. So we are to use the term that's often used, we are going to be at an inflection point, a critical point where really the teeth and what NATO stands for will be judged in Washington. Yes. That's what I'm giving credit to my colleague Ian, who said that at an Atlantic Council panel, where I think you said that very forcefully, and personally, I think he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah, you can freely comment, but I want to add something in the discussion, and this is the elephant in the room in U.S. politics. Mr. Daalder pointed at this. This is the possibility that Donald Trump wins the upcoming election, and in my opinion, viewing it from afar, this summit is so critical because it also will set a record for the upcoming presidency, be it a second Biden or a Trump presidency. So I understand there is a sense of urgency, but what I also want you to comment on is this situation we are discussing right now, and whether NATO shows its teeth or not, also wake-up call for Europe to understand that it needs to act solely and really build upon its strategic and defensive mechanisms.
Let me answer two questions. One, the Trump question, and then how do you measure success, because they're interrelated. If Europe wants Trump to not give Ukraine away, it has to work with the United States now to put Ukraine on a winning streak. If Trump gets elected and Ukraine is at stalemate or losing territory, it's going to reinforce Trump's inclination to saddle up with Putin. It's going to reinforce his impression the Europeans are weak and uncommitted and spineless and feckless. But if he becomes president, I don't think he will, but if he becomes president and Ukraine is on a winning streak, the nature of Trump is he's going to want to be part of the winning party and take credit for it. So now is the time for Europe to act, but to act in coordination and collaboration with the United States and to encourage the Biden administration to act more decisively in its support to Ukraine. And I'll be quick, it's five things. What do you want from the NATO summit on Ukraine? You want unambiguous endorsement of Ukraine's war objectives, total territorial reconstitution. Anything short of that is disillusioning to Ukraine and a green flag for Putin. Two, you want to equip the Ukrainians so they can win decisively without restrictions on equipment to be used against legitimate military targets. And this is where Ivo is absolutely right. NATO can play a role directly in equipping, in training, maybe even creating air defense systems in parts of Ukraine. Third, real economic sanctions. Russia grew by 3% last year. That says something about the inadequacy of the sanctions regime. Four, engaging the Russian people systematically and assertively, using the power of the truth to undermine support for Putin's war. And then fourth, putting Ukraine clearly onto a track of NATO membership now, not an indefinite negotiation process, but now, because accession is part of the win strategy. It is the only way to take Ukraine off the global chessboard that Putin sees giving an opportunity. Those are the five things I'll be measuring the summit off of.
George, I want to jump in. Wait, before you ask your question, because you asked two questions before.
Before you comment, I also wanted to say something, maybe a sixth point, because we've been discussing this in Europe following Emmanuel Macron's comments some months ago, because he actually proposed that we put boots on the ground. That's what happened in the Balkans 25 years ago. So. To be perfect, we were having this discussion back behind the cameras that, for instance, in Greece here, the direct military support of Ukraine is still a taboo for many reasons, historical, religious, geographical, you name it. But the thing is that a leader, a European leader who actually has gravitas when he talks around this table, says we have to prepare ourselves that we may have to enter a war with our own forces. So.
Well, you know, Macron got condemned in certain circles. When I looked at the language, he actually said, he didn't say put them in. He said we should be thinking about a contingency. And I think that's appropriate, because that goes to your question about should we be concerned about what after and Europe. Can we expect any kind of challenge to NATO? So let's put it in context, number one. Number two, just this morning I heard the Greek Prime Minister, who was up in
Lithuania.
Well, he was in Lithuania for the Three Seas initiative, but he was in Poland with Prime Minister Tusk. And I'm mentioning it because he was asked the question, well, should Europe move forward on this common defense fund? And honestly, his answer was yes. Again, about the issue of preparedness.
It's funny that we're still discussing it.
Well,
there's a lot of discussion in Europe.
A lot of discussion, but I will say this. Maybe because of what's happening in Ukraine, it's going to be a forcing event. And maybe because of US elections, and was your question, it will also be a forcing event. And countries here will step forward and say, we got to be prepared for a threat and a challenge. So I wanted to say that. One last comment, because that was your first question about what about the venue of Europe. I think we're seeing very significant movement. The question is, will those words translate into really concrete action, as you just said? The second question about our elections. I will say this. I was very struck when Stoltenberg came to the United States and he spoke before our Congress. And he talked about the measures and steps taken, you know, on behalf of NATO. I think, in my view, when I look at, one, what Trump was putting forward, and also at the time, Stoltenberg and NATO members, quite frankly, I think it was the right time, the right moment. I know that Mattis spoke before the Munich Security Conference, and he posed a question when he was our Secretary of Defense. He said, should the United States care more about the future of individual countries and its next generation in Europe? Where are people going to be putting their monies? You're leaving that to us? I remember many Europeans were struck by that. So the point just in, I wouldn't start scripting what will be or won't be if Trump wins the election this year. But I actually think in its own right, for their own security, countries need to be mobilizing, and this goes to the issue of the teeth of not only NATO, but individual countries.
Yes, I find this perfectly reasonable. Ambassador Daalder.
So coming back to sort of how do you Trump-proof, in some ways, I'm slightly less, I have a slightly different view about how Trump did and will behave if he were to be president. And therefore, I think Trump-proofing is something that in Europe one is talking about. The number one way to Trump-proof is to make sure that by the time we meet in Washington, we have a strategy for victory in Ukraine.
Amen.
If you don't have it, it doesn't matter. And Macron, who in his usual way has the right idea and executes in the wrong way, had the right idea, which, by the way, was already under discussion among the chiefs of defense staff for about a month before he went public, about how can we more practically think about helping Ukraine, either as NATO as an organization or in the Macron vision, actually, as a coalition of the willing. And I think that's an appropriate discussion that has to happen now. If we end up in Washington with disagreement about what is happening in Ukraine and how we're going to handle that, then it really doesn't matter anymore what happens with regard to Donald Trump or anybody else, because the alliance will have failed the test without Donald Trump. That's number one. Number two is the question is not really what will Donald Trump do for NATO. The question is what will you as allies here in Europe think that Donald Trump will do for NATO. And because NATO is actually built on trust, all alliances are built on trust. A piece of paper means nothing unless you think that that piece of paper will lead people to act. If you show me a European leader who on the 20th of January 2025 believes the United States, under all circumstances, will come and defend them. I will show you a European leader who won't be believed by his own people. That's the problem. And therefore, the fundamental need now is for Europe to think about how do you, something they should have done for a long time, and Donald Trump was hardly the first president to say that the Europeans should do more. It started with, guess what, Harry Truman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we still haven't done enough.
And the reason you need to do is because it is fundamentally in your own interest.
Yeah.
And the reason that Europe is spending more on defense has absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump. It has everything to do with Vladimir Putin. And that's the way it should be.
We have a minute left, and I want a short comment from all three of you on what Ambassador Daalder just called a strategy for victory and a clear path for the coming months and years. Do you think that the NATO leaders of the member states are up to it?
Or what?
Are up to it?
Let me put it this way. We have the urgency, because this is an existential moment for the alliance and its credibility. We have the capabilities in terms of our GMP, our military capability. I am concerned about whether or not we have the political will. And I'm looking to President Biden, I'm looking to President Macron, I'm looking to President Duda, and all the other Europeans to actually recognize the urgency of the moment and exercise the political will. The capacity is there.
Ambassador Daalder?
So I think if European and American and Canadian leaders recognize that failure in Ukraine actually means failure for NATO and therefore affects the credibility of the alliance to deter and, if necessary, defend against a direct attack on their territory, they will find the political will to do what is necessary, and that they have all the capabilities. But we have, up to this point, made a distinction between NATO and every inch of territory we're willing to defend, and that part that isn't. And we now need to understand that what happens in Ukraine, unlike in Las Vegas, doesn't stay in Ukraine. And that our ability to make sure that Ukraine succeeds is fundamental for the ability for NATO to succeed.
The last word to Mr. Dobriansky.
I get the last word. I will underscore political will. I think we are speaking about political will. If we do not see an historic summit on the occasion of the 75th anniversary, I think it will send a very bad message here, and not just a message in the European continent, but also literally globally. This war in Ukraine and what NATO does and doesn't do, and in this case, will send a major signal, so it is about political will. I also want to underscore what you just said earlier, and that is, regardless of the elections, by the way, the fact is, it's what action will be taken, full stop, in NATO. All countries have the ability to act and to make a difference. That relates to political will. And finally, I think that I certainly want to commend Simeon, who is here for holding this Delphi Economic Forum and holding this conversation, because, quite frankly, this is an historic moment, and what does happen in Washington, D.C. is actually a very critical one. So thank you. Thank you for the forum, and thank you for Delphi for holding us.
So we were traveling with Mr. Tsomokos, this is on the side. We were traveling together to Vilnius. I don't know if I will meet you on the plane to Washington, but I certainly hope to see you there. Thank you very much for this vivid discussion. It was very interesting for me, journalistically, but also personally. I want to thank you very much.
Thank
you
you
all.